Welcome. I am pleased to be here today as the chair of the George Perkins Marsh Prize Committee, and to be here with our award winner this year, with Jamie Kreiner. Welcome, Jamie.
Thanks for having me. Hi,
Absolutely.
everybody.
Absolutely. You are a professor of history at the University of Georgia, where I think you're also department chair. Is that right?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. Busy times. Thank you for spending some time with us in this quick Zoom interview to talk about your prize-winning book. The book is your second book. The first book, let's see if I got this right, The Social Life of Hagiography in the Merovingian Kingdom. And as that title suggests, you are a medieval historian. And the title of your second book, which is the prize-winning book that we're recognizing today, is Legions of Pigs in the Early Medieval West. It was published by Yale University Press as part of the Yale Agrarian Studies series. And it's a terrific book. And it really impressed the George Perkins Marsh Committee, which included myself, as well as Kate Brown and Andrew Needham. And we really want to encourage all environmental historians to read this book. It is beautifully written, and it really made us think much more deeply about the relations between humans and animals and the environment, but especially about pigs. So we want to give you a little teaser today about what this book is all about and why we're so excited about it. So maybe just start by saying, making a comment about the book, and that it has a real breadth to it, a breadth that's geographical and temporal, but also its source materials. Do you want to situate us a little geographically and temporally in terms, also say something about the sources you drew upon for your work?
The book covers what used to be part of the Western Roman Empire. So in the early Middle Ages, after the Roman Empire fractured in the West, it includes the western part of North Africa. It includes Europe. It includes the British Isles. And then there's looks further afield to the areas that weren't part of the Roman Empire. So Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, Libya. The chronology is roughly 400 to 1,000. It's pretty generous.
It's like 600 years.
Boundary for the early Middle Ages, yeah. And then the source material, I was just really excited coming off my first project to dig into archaeology, which has really advanced a lot in the past few decades. This project wouldn't have been possible without the advances that had happened in bioarchaeology, in particular, the analysis of bone records, of plant remains through seeds and pollen and charcoal, and to a lesser extent through climate history. And it was just really exciting to be able to incorporate material that gives early medievalists access to historical experiences that don't show up in the written record that much. Whole farming communities and villages across the early medieval West suddenly become open to us in a way that the records don't disclose. And so that was really exciting to be able to link this agricultural universe to what had traditionally been considered more high culture that boxed that out, and to see that there were actually links between the two made it a pretty exciting project for me.
Yeah, it's terrific. I mean, everything. I love the zooarchaeology. You look at the ceramics. You have, I mean, the wealth of type of sources that you look at are both visual and even a lot in sort of what I would think of as more traditional sources for that time period, biblical exegesis. I mean, the ways in which you link them together is just terrific. I was envious in some ways of what I think of as a very rich and deep source base. I think, well, wait a minute, we have that too, but we don't take advantage of it. So.
I love to hear that. I love hearing that someone is jealous of an early medievalist's material.
And the other thing that's central to your book, and central is clear from the title as well, is pigs, right? They are ubiquitous. They are visible, you say, in the landscape, in this world, in ways that make them really interesting to follow. So is that why you picked pigs? I mean, why pigs?
Yeah, I mean, part of it was that when I was researching my first book, I was looking through legal material, but also narrative material, they would crop up kind of unexpectedly with surprisingly salient roles in these materials. And so that was a sort of initial question mark. I had also taken a class in grad school with Bill Jordan on rural history in the high Middle Ages. And I loved the class so much, and I thought I would love to get back to agrarian history at some point. And so then, I sort of kept a file on the back burner of pig material, and it kind of indicated to me that there was a lot there. It was nice to kind of having it simmer while I was working on something else. And yeah, then once I started really reading into them, I began with modern mammal biology, because I sort of wanted to get a scope of what we knew about modern pigs. And I learned a lot of exciting stuff there, but also knew, animals change, species evolve. What can we know about the ones in the past? And then it was clear that these earlier animals from antiquity in the Middle Ages were also exhibiting similar traits in some ways. So there was a kind of continuity, at least in the sense that they were also exhibiting behavioral and neuroplasticity. That was one of the most exciting things about pigs, that they can learn both from each other and their environments and make new decisions and think through things, and they're inventive and curious, and their energy is pretty infectious.
And they can manipulate humans, and that's the part that I find most interesting, is the ways in which you really, okay, to use an old-fashioned word, give agency to the pigs, where the pigs have these both intended and unintended consequences in their interactions with the human world. And you look at that not just materially, but sort of intellectually, and even in sort of the way it affects laws and other processes. I mean, it's embedded throughout the book, and even the ways in which the pigs have a religious sense of meanings as well. It's that interesting connection between the material and the mental that I find is a wonderful theme throughout the book.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that enabled that kind of investigation was that early medieval intellectuals and farmers and lawmakers were themselves very conscious of the ways that pigs impacted not only the logistics of farming and their legal policies and their taxes, but also the ways that they conceived of their own spirituality and religious culture. And I think for me, that kind of cognizance of the impact that a seemingly insignificant animal makes on individuals and communities and societies it was exciting to see that kind of reflection that we assumed was only exclusive to post-humanism or postmodernism, but it also enabled a kind of deeper investigation beyond what they were even explicitly observing, and to look at the other ways that maybe even beyond the early medieval line of sight, that pigs were really wending their way into shaping cultural and social forms.
Yeah, and you really argue that pigs have influenced the ways in which humans think, right? You have this argument that I think really interesting about sort of the ecological thinking of the early medieval West, and that's something that might be of particular interest to environmental historians. So what do you mean by this sort of ecological thought that you trace?
Well, I think a really common refrain that you see in animal studies is that we need to break the habit of seeing them as commodities, particularly in the case of livestock or other animals that are exploited for particular economic purposes. And it's definitely true that you see this in the early Middle Ages, but I wasn't expecting the level of sophistication that I found, which is that in addition to seeing their animals as more than just kind of machines that transform objects in the world into meat, pigs are really prompting a kind of thinking about interdependency and flux that is a much more capacious and dynamic way of thinking of the lived environments that people occupied. So most basically, the reason pigs are such a popular animal to keep is because they will eat just about anything, even gross things, but especially things that people don't want to eat themselves, like acorns. You don't see early medieval communities having any interest in eating that particular tree nut. And so pigs become this kind of special coworker that converts all sorts of matter out there in the world into meat that humans really love. And so just in the process of observing these animals doing that kind of conversion process, they start to appreciate the ways that pigs can help them navigate a range of different environments to which they're sensitive and responsive. And on top of that, they're also noticing, although pigs are great at this particular job, they're very adventurous and active animals that can't be entirely constrained. So it adds another layer to this ecological sensibility, where humans become alert to both this working relationship they have with animals, but one that's not totally in their control. And they, in some ways, if they want to keep this relationship to be economically profitable, they have to make certain accommodations. It's like they need to devote a lot of care to these animals, devote more labor than they would for other livestock. They need to develop laws that deal with the inevitable conflicts that are going to arise when pigs get loose and root through other people's crops. And yeah, in the process, there's this sort of third layer of thinking ecologically, which is to say, how can we build policies that are in some ways parallel or analogous to the kind of responsivity and adaptivity that pigs exhibit in the environment. Not that people were consciously saying we need to make our fiscal systems pig-like, but just that they recognize that if something was going to work really well, it couldn't be standardized or rigid.
Yeah, that sort of flexibility of thinking that you sort of argue, it becomes, it moves out of the sort of the material world of working with pigs to the way in which you would think about pigs and the way that it affects both religious thought, but fiscal thought or economic policies. I mean, that's really so nicely done. I love the way you used Anna Singh's a notion of, or draw upon that, it was a salvage accumulation, which is connected to what you're talking about here, this notion of salvage, right? The pigs doing that materially, but also in other realms as well. So it's nice. There's so many great stories in your book. I want to ask you about your favorite pig story, but I think that my favorite characters, besides of course the pigs, are the swineherders, who you give them new life. I mean, they're amazing people in the medieval world. So I guess your favorite pig story, and then maybe we could talk a little bit about swineherders.
Well, one of my favorite pig stories also involves a swineherd. It comes from hagiography, which is a genre I like very much. The point is to use stories about upstanding figures to kind of advocate for social forms that you think should be out there in the world. But this one particular story leaves a lot unsaid. It's about a really bad fall where there's not much fodder or food in the woods for even wild animals to eat. And so the pig herds of the monastery of St. Gall don't have their usual acorn crop. But then the saint of this monastery miraculously guides them to some spot very deep in the woods, which they'd never been to before. And they totally fatten on the pannage crop. And the swineherd is kind of freaked out because he doesn't know how they got there and how they're going to get home. So the saint appears to him in a dream and says, you just need to, give a good smack to the lead sow and everyone else will follow her and, they'll know what to do. And that's what he did. And the pigs all get home very safely. And normally hagiography is sort of mined for, tidbits of what normal life looks like. But this hagiographer is assuming a level of knowledge that we don't have. And actually, a lot of this story is important because it was abnormal. And that one of the things that was abnormal is that the swineherd found himself at a loss as to what to do. They were one of the most highly valued class of farm worker. And in this case, he found himself unable to read his pig's own behavior. They were totally illegible to him. But there's also bits of it that are very spot on in terms of pig behavior, like the fact that a sow kind of acted as a leader. It was common back then. It's common now among wild pigs. They're matriarchal. And this sort of oddity of this miracle was meant to reinforce the fact that people needed to be really attentive to what was normal in the natural world, because it could help them appreciate a miracle when they actually saw one. That, rather than Christianity being a sort of devaluation of animal life, it was actually often in the early Middle Ages an encouraging force to be more attentive to all of the details that were around you, so that you could see how complex creation actually was, and then be able to interpret new variations in it in a more accurate way. But yeah, so going back to swine herds, they're, as I point out in the book, they're not very well documented. I would love to have found a guide to what good swine herding looks like, but of course no one wrote stuff like that in the early Middle Ages. So it was a lot of sort of fishing through, narrative sources and legal material to get a guess at what they might have known. But I think that was maybe one of the most frustrating parts of the book, is how much tacit knowledge has just been lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's sort of the material knowledge of doing it. You do a wonderful job of, as I mentioned at the beginning, using zooarchaeology or bioarchaeology to sort of read that sort of evidence that's there, as well as then the biblical exegeses and other types of art and a wide range of type of sources to piece together these materials, which is fascinating. And one of the things I found really interesting is this connection between, again, the material and the intellectual, and particularly those that go through the stomach. About there's lots of interest in food studies, and animal studies is related to that, but who eats pigs? And that becomes an issue, doesn't it? Isn't that part of this conversation in the early medieval period, is around who has access to pigs, who actually eats pigs, who doesn't eat pigs, what prohibitions are against pigs. Let's talk about eating bacon.
Yeah, so one line that we notice in terms of consumption breaks along class. Mm-hmm. It tends to be the case, not always, but we can generalize a little bit, that eaters of elite status will eat more pork. And eat more than what is typical for their given region, because consumption varies a lot depending on local ecologies and economic networks. But you also see this a little bit among military settlements, particularly in the late Roman period, and then again when you get fortified settlements toward the Central Middle Ages. You also tend to see more piglets being eaten among affluent eaters, because it's a conspicuous form of waste. It doesn't cost very much to turn a piglet into a pig. So eating the little ones is a sign that you don't have to make them larger. It's also a sign too of a kind of complicated patterns of landholding and tenure, where it seems like tenants on elite estates often owed payments of some kind in piglets or pork. So class, yes, that's one split. Another is religion. I was expecting to see pigs as being more emblematic of religious identity right out of the gate in the early Middle Ages, but that doesn't happen. It seems to have developed in the early Middle Ages and kind of late. Normally, I mean, it was the case that Jews didn't eat pork. And as far as we can tell, most Muslims didn't either, although there are examples of elite Muslims boar hunting. But as far as we can tell, only Christians in the West were eating pork. But it doesn't become a kind of polarizing identity symbol in the way that we'd expect. We see in rabbinic traditions in Judaism, and then also in early Hadith traditions in Islam, that pig eating is associated with Romanness, because Romans were notorious lovers of pork, even though they didn't eat it as much as beef. So yeah, it breaks along religion, and it breaks along ecology too, like I mentioned earlier. So you don't see pork eating in Greenland because the land really can't sustain them unless you're paying for their fodder, which defeats the point of keeping pigs. And in some regions, like in Gaul, pork consumption can be quite high, and then in other places like Central Iberia or in North Africa, it's pretty low.
Yeah. Well, a pig runs through it all, right? Exactly. And we've only touched the surface of the book here, and the wonderful ideas that you outline through the process of tracing pigs through the early medieval West, but really through both their material and intellectual realms, in the ways in which humans and animals intersect in all sorts of ways, from the stomach to the mind, right? So I'm going to tell our listeners to go off and get this book. It's Legions of Pigs in the Early Medieval West by Jamie Kreiner, the winner of this year's George Perkins Marsh Award. Congratulations again, and thank you so much for sharing your book with us, but also your ideas today.
Thanks, Katherine.